I hadn't been there even a whole week when heck busted loose. It was Saturday. These orderlies came in from the emergency room, yelling for Eddie to get ready for a mess in the x-ray. A couple of hardbinds, they said, just the way the people always said that. Eddie asked how much of a hurry it was, and if he needed help to hold them still. And they said, half and half. One of them is hot and the other's cold. I didn't have time to think about what they meant before Jolene Shanks, or Hardbind rather, was rolled in on a wheelchair and then came a stretcher right behind her, which they parked out in the hallway. Jolene looked like the part of a movie you don't want to watch. There was a wet tongue of blood from her right shoulder all the way down to her bosom, and all the color was pulled out of her lips and face, her big face, like a piece of something cut out of white dough. She was fighting and cursing, though, and clearly a far cry from dead. When I took one of her wrists to help her out of the wheelchair, it twisted away under my fingers like a sleeve full of cables. She was still yelling at Newt, "Don't do it," and things like that. "Go ahead and carry your daddy for all I care. He's the one you want. Not yourself and not me." Then she would go still for a minute, and then she'd start up again. I wondered what Newt's daddy had to do with it. They said Doc Finchler was called and on his way, but that Nurse McCullers had checked her over and it wasn't as bad as it looked. The bleeding was stopped, but they would need x-rays to see where the bullet was and if it had cracked anything on its way in. I looked at Eddie, wanting to know would I have to get her out of her top and brassiere into one of the gowns, and couldn't help thinking about the bloodstains all over the creation, having been raised, you might say, in the cleaning up business. But Eddie said no, that we didn't want to move her around that much. Doc would just have to see around the hooks and the snaps. Lucky for you, he was a bad shot, Eddie was telling Jolene as he straightened her arm out on the table, which I thought to be rude under the circumstance. But then that was Eddie. I held her by the elbows, trying not to hurt her any more than she was already hurt. But poor thing, she was hysterical and fighting me and wouldn't shut up. In my mind's eye, I couldn't see myself in my lead apron standing over Jolene. And this is exactly what I look like. A butcher holding down a calf on its way to becoming a cut of meat. Then Eddie said we were done. For me to keep her in the room next door until they could see if the pictures came out. They might have to do them over if she moved. Then he yelled for the other one, and the two guys rolled in the long stretcher with the sheet over it and started hoisting it up on the table like something served on a big dinner plate. I stood there like a fool until Eddie yelled at me to get on out and looked after Jolene. He wasn't needing me to hold this one down, because he wasn't going anyplace. Just another pretty picture of the coroner's office. Eddie said, but I couldn't stop standing. Maybe I'm slow. I didn't understand until just then. I didn't understand until just then that under that sheet, that was Newt. In the room next door, there was a stretcher intended for Jolene, but she would have none of it. She took one of the hard wooden seats that swung down from the wall and sat there blubbering, saying, "Thank God the baby was at Mom's," saying, "What am I going to do now?" She had on this pink top that was loose, so it could have gone either way, if you were pregnant or if you weren't. As far as I know, she wasn't just then. It had these little openings on the shoulders and bows on the sleeves, though of course it was shut to heck now. Jolene was a pie-faced heavy girl, and I always thought she looked the type to have gone and found trouble just to show you didn't have to be a cheerleader to be fast. The trouble with that is it doesn't get you anywhere. No more than some kid on a bicycle going no hands and no feet and down past his mother and hollering his head off to her to look. She's not going to look till he runs into something and busts his head wide open. Jolene and I had never been buddies or anything. She was a year or two ahead of me in school when she dropped out. But I guess when you just been shot and your husband's dead, you look for a friend in whoever there is to hand you a Tylenol with codeine. She started telling me that it was all Newt Daddy's fault. He beat her up, and even had hit the baby with the colt scuttle. I was trying to think how a half-dead old man could beat up on Newt, who was built like a side of beef. But then they all lived together in one house, and it was small. And of course the old man couldn't hear, so it would have been that kind of life. There wouldn't be much talk. I don't remember what I said. Just, mostly. And you're going to be okay. She kept saying she didn't know what was going to happen now with her and the baby and old man Hardbind. Oh, Lord. What had she gotten herself into? It wasn't the kindest thing, maybe, but at one point I actually asked her, Jolene, why Newt? She was slumped down and rocking a little bit in the chair, holding her hurt shoulder and looking at her feet. She had these eyes that never seemed to open all the way. What she said was, why not? My daddy been calling me practically since I was 13, so why not? Knew it was just who it had happened to be. You know, the way it is. I told her I didn't know because I didn't have a daddy, but I was lucky that way. She said yeah. By the time it was over, it seemed to me it ought to be dark outside. As if such a thing couldn't have happened in daylight. But it was high noon, a whole afternoon ahead, and everybody acting like here we were working for our money. I went to the bathroom and threw up twice, then came back and looked in the microscope at the little catcher's mitts, counting the same ones over and over all afternoon. Nobody gave me any trouble about it. The woman that gave up that blood, anyway, got her money's worth. I wanted Mama to be home when I got there, so I couldn't bawl my head off and tell her I was quitting, but she wasn't. And by the time she came in with a bag of groceries and a bushel basket of ironing for the weekend, I was over it for the most part. I told the whole thing, even Jolene's pink bow ribbon top and the blood and all, and of course Newt. And then I told her I'd probably seen the worst I was going to see, so there was no reason to quit now. She gave me the biggest hug and said, Missy, I never seen the likes of you. We didn't talk too much more about it, but I felt better with her there. The two of us moving around each other in the kitchen, making boiled greens and eggs for dinner, while it finally went dark outside. Every once in a while, she would look over at me and shake her head. There are two things about Mama. One is she always expected the best out of me. And the other is that then, no matter what I did, whatever I came home with, she acted like it was the moon I had just hung in the sky and plugged in all the stars. I had just hung up the moon in the sky and plugged in all the stars. Like I was that good. I kept that job. I stayed there over 5.5 years and counted more platelets than you can think about. A person might think I didn't do much else with all that time other than keeping Mama entertained and off and on dating Sparky Pike, who most people consider to be a high-class catch because he had a steady job as a gas meter man. Until I got fed up with hearing who laid out in their backyards by their meters, wearing what or nothing but what in the summertime. But I had a plan. In our high school days, the general idea of fun had been to paint the class of 1975 on the water tower, or maybe tie some farmers' goats up there on Halloween. But now I had serious intentions. In my first few years at Pittman County Hospital, I was able to help Mama out with the rents and the bills and still managed to save up a couple $100. With most of it I bought a car, a 55 Volkswagen Bug, with no windows to speak of, and no back seat and no starter. But it was easy to push start without help once you got the hang of it. The wrong foot on the clutch and the other leg out the door. Especially if you parked on a hill, which in that part of Kentucky you could hardly do anything but. In this car, I intended to drive out of Pittman County one day and never look back, except maybe for Mama. The day I brought it home, she knew I was going to get away. She took one look and said, "Well, if you're going to have you an old car, you're going to have to know how to drive an old car." What she meant was how to handle anything that came along with it. I suppose she stood in the road with her arms crossed and watched while I took off all 4 tires and put them back on. "That's good, Missy," she said. "You'll drive away from here yet. I expect the last of you I'll see of you will be your hind end," she said. "What do you do if I let the air out of the front tire?" Which she did. I said, "Easy. I put on the spare," which, believe it or not, that dang old car actually had. Then she let out the back one too, and said, "Now what?" Mama had evidently run into trouble along these lines. At some point of her life with Foster and an Oldsmobile, she wanted to be sure I was prepared. I thought, then I said, "I have a bicycle pump. I can get enough air in it to drive down to Norman Strix and get it pumped up the rest of the way." And she just stood there with her arms crossed, and I could see that she nor God nor anybody else was going to do it for me. So I closed my eyes and went at that tire for everything I was worth. Mama hadn't been there that day. She couldn't know that all I was seeing behind those shut eyes was Newt Harbine's daddy flying up into the air in slow motion, like a fish flinging sideways out of the water. And Newt laid out like a hooked bass. When I drove over the Pittman line, I made 2 promises to myself. One I kept, the other I did not. The first was that I would get myself a new name. I wasn't crazy about anything. I'd been called up to that point in my life. And this seemed like the time to make a clean break. I didn't have any special name in mind, but just wanted to change. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that a name is not something a person really has the right to pick out, but it's something you're provided with, more or less by chance. I decided to let the gas tank decide. Whether it ran out, I'd look for a sign. I came pretty close to being named after Homer, Illinois, but kept pushing. I kept my fingers crossed through Cindy, Sodoris, Cerro Gordo, Decatur, and Blue Mountain, and coasted into Taylorville and on the fumes. And so I am Taylor Green. I suppose you could say I had some part in choosing this name, but there was enough of destiny in it to satisfy me. The second promise, the one that I broke, had to do with where I would end up. I had looked at some maps, but since I never, in my own memory, been outside of Kentucky, I was evidently born across the river in Cincinnati, but that's beside the point. I had no way of knowing why or how any particular place might be preferable to any other. That is, apart from the pictures of the gas station brochures. Tennessee claimed to be the voluntary state, and Missouri the show-me state, whatever that might mean, and nearly every place appeared to have plenty of ladies in 50s hairdos standing near waterfalls.